The summer of 1980 arrived with an unusual stillness in the small, tight-knit town of Ellensworth. Known for its tree-lined streets, aging Victorian homes, and a community where everyone knew everyone, the town seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world. That illusion shattered one sweltering June morning when Mayor Thomas Whitmore and his 16-year-old daughter, Lily, vanished without a trace. Their absence was first noticed when Thomas failed to appear at a scheduled town council meeting, an unthinkable lapse for the punctual and dependable mayor. His secretary tried calling his home repeatedly, but there was no answer. By evening, concern turned to panic. Neighbors reported last seeing Thomas and Lily leaving their house early that morning in his forest green Chevrolet, but they never arrived at their usual destinations. Lily hadn't shown up for her summer art class, and no one had seen the car on any of the main roads leading out of town. When local police entered the Whitmore home, they found breakfast dishes still in the sink, beds neatly made, and nothing disturbed. It looked as if the pair had intended to return within the hour. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and oddly, none of Lily's personal items appeared to be missing. Her purse still sat on her dresser, untouched. The entire town mobilized to search, combing nearby woods, scouring rivers, even knocking on doors miles outside the city limits. The state police were brought in, followed by a handful of volunteers from surrounding counties. Still, nothing emerged. As days turned into weeks, the leads dried up. Theories ran wild. Had they been kidnapped, or had the mayor discovered something he shouldn't have? Was it a planned disappearance, or something more sinister? With no bodies, no notes, and no witnesses, the case quickly became Ellensworth's most painful and perplexing mystery, the kind that left a permanent scar on every whispered conversation and sleepless night. The search for Mayor Thomas Whitmore and his daughter Lily consumed the town for months, but as the summer faded into fall, the trail grew colder with every passing day. Helicopters had scoured the forests, divers had explored the lakes and rivers, and law enforcement had followed every possible lead, but nothing ever pointed to a resolution. Flyers bearing their faces, once plastered on telephone poles and shop windows, slowly curled at the edges and were eventually taken down, replaced by seasonal announcements and lost pet notices. The absence of evidence, no abandoned car, no ransom note, no witnesses, gave rise to a chilling silence that wrapped itself around Ellensworth like a shroud. The townspeople, once animated with concern and speculation, gradually returned to their routines, though unease lingered beneath the surface. At the diner, whispers filled the corners over steaming cups of coffee. Some said the mayor had run afoul of dangerous men. Others believed Lily had discovered something she wasn't meant to know. A few murmured about curses, pointing to the church on the hill, long rumored to harbor secrets of its own. But without proof, all anyone had were shadows. The case eventually landed in the state archives, labeled unsolved, its file gathering dust like so many others. Mayor Whitmore's house was locked up and left to age, the once pristine garden growing wild. The town council appointed a new mayor, and Lily's high school held a memorial service in her honor, though her desk in the third row remained empty for the rest of the year. 8 years is a long time, and Ellensworth tried to heal, though it never quite succeeded. Parents became more watchful, children were warned not to wander, and a quiet fear settled into the town's bones. The mystery of the disappearance became a local legend, a grim tale passed down with a heavy pause, a story told in hushed tones during storms or power outages. It was as if the town had learned to live with the question, even though the answer had always been closer than anyone dared to imagine. Over time, Ellensworth wore its grief like weathered stone, still standing, but changed forever. By the late 1980s, life on the surface had returned to a kind of uneasy normalcy. Children still rode their bikes down cracked sidewalks, shopkeepers opened their stores at dawn, and the annual harvest fair continued to draw families to the town square. Yet beneath every routine beat of small-town life, there lingered an unspoken heaviness. Conversations still paused when someone mentioned the Whitmores. No one ever dared move into the mayor's old house, even though the real estate listing quietly expired years ago. But perhaps nowhere did the town's sorrow settle more heavily than on the crumbling silhouette of St. Mary's Church. Perched on a gentle rise overlooking Main Street, the church had once been Ellensworth's heart, a place where generations were baptized, married, and mourned. Its tall, Gothic steeple had rung out every Sunday morning, calling families to worship. But after the mayor's disappearance, attendance dwindled. Some said it was the creeping disrepair, the cracked stained glass windows, the peeling paint, the sagging roof beams. Others whispered it felt different now. Hollow. The townsfolk began to keep their distance, murmuring tales of odd sounds echoing from the bell tower late at night or strange lights flickering behind the boarded-up windows. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside, but few ever followed through. Even the clergy seemed reluctant to remain after sunset. Eventually, the church was shuttered, its doors padlocked, its pews collecting dust. Vines crept up its sides, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim it. Still, it stood, a monument to something forgotten, or deliberately ignored. Though the town no longer spoke of it aloud, everyone knew St. Mary's held a piece of the mystery. Its looming presence reminded Ellensworth of unfinished stories, of something left undone. The church had become a silent observer of the town's sorrow, holding secrets within its rotting walls, waiting patiently for the day they would no longer stay hidden. In the spring of 1988, after nearly a decade of decay, the town council finally approved a modest budget to renovate St. Mary's Church. It wasn't out of spiritual revival or sudden generosity, it was practicality. The church, though abandoned, sat at the town's center and had become something of an eyesore. Complaints had piled up about the overgrown grounds, the collapsed section of roof visible from Main Street, and concerns that the building might attract vagrants or become a hazard. So, under quiet agreement, they hired a small team of local contractors to begin restorative work. When the first workers arrived, the air around the church felt thick, almost reluctant. Some joked about ghosts. Others said nothing at all, choosing instead to focus on the tangible tasks, stabilizing the structure, repairing the roof, reinforcing the bell tower. The crew began by stripping away layers of rot, scraping back old plaster, tearing up warped floorboards, and hauling out pews whose cushions had long been gnawed by mice. Dust rose in clouds, coating every beam of sunlight with golden haze. For weeks, the renovation progressed without incident. It was exhausting work, dirty and slow, but the team chipped away dutifully. Yet those closest to the job couldn't shake a sense of unease. Tools went missing, only to be found in strange places. The air in the bell tower always felt colder than the rest of the building, even on warm days. One man claimed he heard whispering while working alone near the altar, though no one else had been nearby. Then, during a routine inspection of the bell tower's interior framework, one of the younger workers noticed something odd behind the western wall, a hollow sound where there should have been solid wood. He tapped again. Hollow. Curious, he called over the foreman, and together they pried back the cracked wooden panel. It splintered with a reluctant groan, revealing a sealed cavity behind it, about 5 feet wide and as deep as a closet. A musty gust of air escaped, stale and ancient. Inside, veiled in shadow, were two forms slumped together. The workers froze, heartbeats hammering. What they'd found wasn't just part of the church's structure. It was a long-buried truth, preserved behind that wall for 8 long years. The past had been waiting, entombed within the church's spine, and now, finally, it had begun to speak. The moment the cavity in the wall was opened, a heavy, still air poured out, thick with the scent of aged wood, dust, and something else, something metallic and sour that none of the workers could quite name. Flashlights trembled in their hands as beams of light cut through the dark void, illuminating the unmistakable contours of 2 skeletal figures. They sat slumped together, half-curled, their bones tangled in a final, intimate embrace. Time had stripped them of flesh, of identity, but there was no mistaking the human tragedy hidden in that forgotten space. The room, if it could be called that, had been sealed with care. Nails had been driven in with precision. The wood was newer than the surrounding architecture, no more than a decade old. The discovery sent an eerie hush over the worksite. Someone turned off the radio that had been playing softly in the background. Another worker instinctively crossed himself. Cell phones didn't yet exist, and it took nearly an hour for the sheriff to arrive after being summoned by a rattled contractor who could barely string his words together. Sheriff Donovan, older now than when he had first investigated the Whitmore case, stood at the edge of the opening, his face pale and drawn. Even before the forensics team arrived, he knew what they had found. He recognized the slender shape of the smaller skeleton, still wearing remnants of a floral dress. And there, beside her, resting near the collarbone of the larger figure, was a rusted keyring, the mayor's. Donovan had seen it 100 times, hanging from Thomas Whitmore's belt during town hall meetings. It had an antique brass compass attached, a gift from the mayor's father, engraved with his initials. That keyring had never been found during the investigation. The silence around the scene deepened as more town officials and forensic specialists arrived. The church, once filled with hymns and prayers, now held only breathless disbelief. Someone gently reached in and pulled out a broken rosary from beneath the bones, its wooden beads darkened with age and grime. A single silver cross, now tarnished, lay between the two bodies as if placed there deliberately. Photographs were taken, sketches drawn, and the scene was carefully documented before the remains were removed. But it was already clear, these were not simply two people who had died unnoticed. They had been hidden, entombed. Whoever had sealed them in had done so with intent and precision. As the cavity was closed back up for the night, the church seemed to exhale, as if some long-held burden had been loosened. But the town had only just begun to reckon with the truth. Behind that panel wasn't just a tragic discovery, it was the reopening of a wound no one had truly let heal. The bodies were transported under heavy cover of night to the county coroner's office, but word spread faster than any official report. By the following morning, Ellensworth was humming with a nervous energy it hadn't felt in years. The local paper ran a one-word headline in bold across its front page: "Found." Most didn't need to read the article. Everyone knew who the skeletons were. There had only ever been one pair missing in the town's quiet history: Mayor Thomas Whitmore and his daughter, Lily. Confirmation came quickly. The coroner identified them through dental records and personal artifacts found at the scene. The rusted keyring, Lily's tiny silver ring still clinging to one bony finger, and the fabric remnants of her dress were all unmistakable. The town's worst fear was finally confirmed, but the reality brought no peace, only more questions. They hadn't disappeared into the wilderness or fled town. They'd been inside the church the entire time, entombed in its very walls. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Parents clutched their children a little closer. Elderly residents who remembered the mayor's firm handshake or Lily's bright smile wept openly at the news. The church, already considered eerie, became something else entirely: part crypt, part crime scene, part monument to betrayal. Detectives reopened the long-dormant case, combing through the details with new urgency. They walked the grounds of St. Mary's, examined old blueprints, and interviewed everyone who had any connection to the church. Questions mounted rapidly. How had two people ended up sealed in a space barely large enough for them to crouch in? Why had no one ever searched the church more thoroughly? Who had nailed the boards shut, hiding them so carefully for so long? As investigators returned to the structure, they noticed something they hadn't before. The nails used to seal the wall were all of one kind: thick, hand-forged, the kind used by the church's original craftsmen. Whoever did this hadn't used common tools or rushed the job. They had done it slowly, methodically. Some theorized that the killer must have had a key to the church, maybe even had access to its hidden rooms. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was deliberate concealment. Even more disturbing was the positioning of the bodies. They weren't haphazardly placed. Lily's skeletal hand still rested lightly on her father's arm, as if they had waited together, perhaps prayed together, as the wall closed in around them. The broken rosary found between them was a cruel irony, faith twisted into a tombstone. Rumors swirled. Some insisted the mayor had discovered something dangerous, perhaps financial corruption or secrets involving the church itself. Others whispered that he had sought sanctuary, tried to protect Lily from an unnamed threat, only to be betrayed from within. Theories ranged from clergy conspiracies to old feuds reignited. But one question pressed hardest on the minds of everyone in Ellensworth: if they were hiding in the church, who locked them in? And why had that person kept silent for 8 long years? In the days following the grim discovery, the town of Ellensworth teetered on the edge of shock and revelation. The investigation, long dormant, roared back to life with a ferocity no one had anticipated. Detectives from the state descended on the town, poring over decades-old records, interviewing aging witnesses, and examining every inch of St. Mary's Church. What they found wasn't just dust and decay, but a trail of clues that had been overlooked, ignored, or possibly concealed, from the beginning. The first break came from an old journal found in the basement of the church, buried beneath a pile of water-damaged hymnals. It had belonged to Father Martin Hale, the church's pastor at the time of the mayor's disappearance. Pages were warped and ink blurred, but investigators recovered several key entries. One, dated June 13, 1980, the day after the Whitmores vanished, read cryptically, "They came to me for sanctuary. I gave them what I could. God forgive me for what I allowed." The journal sent shockwaves through the case. If the Whitmores had sought refuge in the church, then it wasn't simply a hiding place, it was a last resort. More digging revealed that Mayor Whitmore had been looking into irregularities in the town's financial records weeks before his disappearance. Whispered stories of embezzlement and land theft, once dismissed as idle gossip, now took on new weight. The most startling piece came from a now retired contractor who had helped with minor repairs on the church in the early 80s. Under pressure from investigators, he admitted to being asked by Father Hale to seal a section of the bell tower wall to protect the structure from drafts. He said he had never questioned it, but now, visibly shaken, realized he had unknowingly walled up a tomb. Then came the confirmation that stopped the town cold. The door to the bell tower had not just been closed, it had been locked from the outside. The old mechanism, nearly rusted shut, bore scrape marks and signs of tampering. Someone had ensured that once Thomas and Lily were inside, they would never get out. This was no accident. No fleeing father and daughter caught in some tragic collapse. They had been intentionally trapped, their lives slowly fading behind a wooden wall while the town moved on, unaware, or unwilling to see. The rosary, the embrace, the silence, it all pointed to desperation and betrayal. As news broke, theories reignited like wildfire. Some believed the killer had to be someone close to the church, maybe even within the clergy. Others whispered about figures in the town council, hinting that Thomas had been silenced for what he knew. Few wanted to speak openly, but behind closed doors, names were being spoken again, names that hadn't been uttered in years. Ellensworth was no longer a town haunted by a mystery. It was now a town confronting a cover-up, one woven tightly into the very walls of its most sacred place. And as investigators drew closer to the truth, one thing became painfully clear: someone among them had known all along, and chosen silence over justice. As investigators closed in on the truth, the atmosphere in Ellensworth thickened with a tension that hadn't been felt since the summer of 1980. The past was no longer a shadow, it had taken shape, breathing again through evidence, confessions, and long-buried guilt. Old relationships fractured as questions resurfaced. Who could have betrayed the town's beloved mayor, and why had that betrayal gone unspoken for 8 long years? The final pieces of the mystery fell into place slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the truth itself resisted the light. It was a piece of church ledger paper, brittle with age, that brought the story full circle. Found tucked inside an old donation box, it recorded a midnight entry, unusual, private, and unsigned, detailing a sanctuary arrangement on June 12, 1980. The handwriting was matched to Father Martin Hale. Cross-referenced with journal entries and witness interviews, it became clear: Thomas Whitmore had discovered corruption involving several powerful town figures, land deals, siphoned funds, and falsified church records. He had turned to the church, and to Father Hale, not just for protection, but as a last attempt to reveal the truth. But someone had followed him. Someone who knew what Thomas had learned, and who realized the church's sanctity could offer not protection, but the perfect cover. The door to the bell tower was locked from the outside with a heavy iron bar, one only accessible with a master key, the kind only a handful of people held. Among them was Councilman Richard Greaves, one of Whitmore's oldest political allies. When confronted with the evidence, records, witness testimony, the unshakable timeline, Greaves finally confessed. On the night in question, he had followed the Whitmores, convinced Thomas intended to go public the next morning with everything he had uncovered. Greaves confronted them at the church. An argument ensued, desperate and quiet under the church's dark rafters. Whether he intended to kill them or simply contain them until a plan could be made, no one would ever fully know. But when the door was barred and the wall sealed, Thomas and Lily were left behind. Hale, complicit by silence, died years later, his guilt hidden in his writings, his soul never quite at peace. As news of Greaves' confession broke, the town reacted not with outrage, but with a strange, stunned stillness. For 8 years, the killer had lived among them, hosted community picnics, attended town meetings, lit candles in the church he had turned into a tomb. No one had suspected. A week later, a memorial was held at St. Mary's, its first true service in years. The bell rang for Thomas and Lily, this time not as a call to prayer, but a reckoning. The townspeople gathered beneath the same steeple that had once kept the secret of their mayor's final moments. Children who had grown up with stories of their disappearance now stood with candles in hand, watching light flicker across the newly restored stained glass windows. And as the ceremony ended, the final, most haunting question remained, etched not into any police report or article, but into the hearts of those who had lived through it. If justice took 8 years to speak, how many others had chosen silence over truth? And who else, still, might be holding onto secrets buried in the bones of Ellensworth?